Can I say it? Dracarys Vermax.
Welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and
begun the Targaryan Civil War has.
This event is called the Dance of Dragons, and it is the most defining event in the history of Westeros, because this event will hasten the death of all the dragons. The day the dragons died. But not every dragon dies in this war. In fact, as Tyrion Lannister tells us,
then Daenerys' ancestors started chaining them up in pens. A few generations later, the lost dragons were no larger than cats.
the dragons actually held on for another 2 decades after this war, but they became sickly, small, and died out. But how this happened was always a mystery that was only vaguely alluded to in Game of Thrones. But now, House of the Dragon has given us some clues about how exactly the dragons died out and why the Targaryens were able to control them, and how all of this connects to the Lord of Light, the Ice Zombies, and the prophecy that was fulfilled by Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen. I'm here to break this theory down and explain what all of this really means. Basically, Game of Thrones Season 8 finally makes sense. Now, first I have to talk about how the Dragon Extinction is addressed in the book A Feast for Crows. Archmaester Marwyn tells Samwell Tarly, "Who do you think killed all the dragons the last time around? Gallant dragon slayers armed with swords? The world the Citadel is building has no place in it for sorcery or prophecy or glass candles, much less for dragons." But I do have to note that this is never confirmed by George R. R. Martin himself. This is one maester telling Sam that people of his order did away with the dragons. On the surface, this makes sense. The maesters are all about science and reason, and they probably thought that by ridding the world of dragons, they were asserting reason over superstition. But it's unlikely that the maesters could have poisoned these dragons in a way that prevented their eggs from hatching. See, basically, the dragons stopped laying eggs that hatched, and the ones that did hatch were like small, sickly, and never grew. And as we saw in House of the Dragon, the maesters had no interactions with the dragons. That was the province of the dragon keepers. So in a little bit, I'm going to talk about the efforts to revive dragons, which could also disprove that their extinction was a conspiracy by the maesters. Instead, I think that the extinction of the dragons is tied directly to Aegon's prophecy, the secret of the Targaryen dynasty. This was the major reveal of House of the Dragon that recontextualized the entire original series. The reason Aegon even bothered to conquer Westeros is because he had a dream of the Long Night.
And if the world of men is to survive, a Targaryen must be seated on the Iron Throne.
And he called this dream a Song of Ice and Fire, and had it carved into his dagger by Valyrian smiths. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about how this prophecy came true in Game of Thrones and the magical forces that guided Aegon along this path. But I think this prophecy also explains why the dragons allow themselves to be commanded by the Targaryens. Remember what Viserys said.
The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion.
So a little backstory on the dragons that's going to be important for later. Though there are differing accounts, most people agree that the Valyrians discovered dragons in a place called the 14 Flames, basically a ring of 14 active volcanoes. The Valyrians bonded with these dragons through blood magic, binding their blood to the dragons. And this event supposedly occurred just after the original Long Night, thousands of years ago. That's an important detail for later. The Targaryens have something unique in their blood that allows them to bond with the dragons. They are tied to this magic of old Valyria, where the dragons came from. In the same way, the Stark kids are tied to their direwolves. The dragons are guided by powerful magical forces, and the dragon's purpose is to end the Long Night. The Targaryens are able to control the dragons as long as they share this goal, to fend off the ice zombie apocalypse. It's even possible that the dragons are aware that this is their purpose. After all, they are intelligent.
Dragons are intelligent. More intelligent than men, according to some maesters.
And we've also seen dragons take on the temperament of their riders. When Daenerys was in Meereen, she struggled to contain the revolts. And that is when she also struggled to contain Drogon's appetites.
My girl. My little girl.
So I'm telling you this to establish a connection between what the Targaryens themselves want and the dragon's goal of ending the Long Night. So Aegon's dream was passed down to his heirs, but the Targaryen Civil War is when the family started to rule for their own lust for power and not for the good of the realm. They forget that their purpose is to end the Long Night. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if Rhaenyra was never able to pass on this secret to anyone else in her family, so the secret of Aegon's prophecy died with her. Thus, the magic that kept the dragons alive and tied the dragons to the Targaryens, that magic died out, and the dragons died with it because they are no longer in service against the Long Night. Instead, they are only serving the Targaryen family's ambitions. Now, that is a lot to take in, but don't worry, I'm going to explain each aspect of that theory. First of all, I want to go over the religions of Westeros Westeros and all the different kinds of magic. So you can see this actually explains everything that we've seen in Game of Thrones. And by the way, if you would like to support our channel, please check out our merch store at shopzeroedition.com, link in the description. We have ScreenCrush branded shirts, hats, sweatshirts, and every month we have a new limited release, like this sweet original trilogy t-shirt, or our newest release, Not the Bees.
Not the bees! Ah!
So please help support our channel by checking out the shop. Everything is high quality fabric, fits great, and hey, let us know what else we should be selling down in the comments. Now where were we? Oh yes, the many religions of Game of Thrones.
Maybe it is the Seven, or maybe it's the old gods, or maybe it's the Lord of Light, or maybe they're all the same f***ing thing.
So Game of Thrones is a story about many religious faiths.
I swear it by the old gods and the new.
Yeah, and what do they mean about the old gods?
Well, Doug, a lot of our viewers already know this, but I'll go through it TLDR for you. Westeros used to be populated by these magical people called Children of the Forest. You remember them from Game of Thrones. And we don't know much about them, except these weirwood trees of theirs were tied to the old gods of their land, and that they could use the trees as a kind of communications network to commune with the land. So, when you hear people in Game of Thrones swear by the old gods, they mean the gods tied to these trees and tied to the Children of the Forest. Now, there's a lot of theories about this, about if the children turn into trees when they die, but look, I just want to stick to what we know. Now, in Game of Thrones, Bran becomes the three-eyed raven, which means that he can essentially see all of space and time, which makes him sound like he just ate a full tray of every pop brownie ever made.
It means I can see everything. Everything that's ever happened to everyone. It's all pieces now. Fragments.
The magic of the three-eyed raven is the magic of these old gods. Now, the first men entered Westeros and slaughtered the Children of the Forest. In the show, this leads the children to use dragon glass to create White Walkers from one of these men. And that man becomes the Night King, the leader of the ice zombie apocalypse, who is responsible for the first long night. Now, I always really like this idea because it means that the original sin of this world was the genocide that men committed against the Children of the Forest. So the real bad guys were colonialism all along.
What?
So, the Night King led to the Long Night and the champion Azor Ahai, who I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. The important thing to note is that the first men actually came around to worshipping these old gods, but then another force called the Andals swept in and basically force converted everyone to their own religion, the worship of the seven gods. And I should note that of all the religions in Game of Thrones, the seven are the only ones who we never see perform any actual magic. So those gods are probably made up. And because Westeros worships imaginary gods, this means that they have no magical forces to protect them, making them vulnerable to the reemergence of White Walkers. Anyways, there are other gods worshipped in Game of Thrones, like the drowned god who resurrects the true king of the Iron Islands. And by the way, when I say that the magic died with the dragons, I'm really only talking about the magic in Westeros. Across the Narrow Sea in Essos, magic was still alive, although weakened. There's the blood magic of the witch who curses Khal Drogo. And of course, there is the many-faced god worshipped by the assassins in the House of Black and White.
I see the stranger. I see the drowned god. I see the wayward face.
There is only one God.
Now, they basically believe that every god is the same god, and that it just wears many faces, and that the real force behind everything is death.
And there is only one thing we say to death. Not today.
There are also the Warlocks in the House of the Undying. They wanted Daenerys' dragons to reinvigorate their own waning magic. And there was also Quaithe, a shadowbender from Asai. And there's another very important person from these Asai Shadowlands who serves a god who is very, very real. I'm talking about Melisandre, the servant of the Lord of Light. Now, this is where we really get into the heart of this show. The Lord of the Light is the most powerful god in this series. We see people perform miracles in this guy's name. Melisandre creates a shadow baby assassin. A red priest named Thoros of Myr resurrected Beric Dondarrion seven times? Like a lot of times, like 6 or 7. Melisandre has a magical necklace that works better than any moisturizer ever created. And of course, she is able to resurrect Jon Snow. Now, I should note, though, that she does not command the Lord of Light, or even really understand him. Melisandre believes that she has been chosen to bring about the coming of the prince who is promised. That's the second coming of Azor Ahai. I'm going to explain Azor Ahai in detail in just a second, but basically, this is a prophecy about the chosen one who's destined to defeat the ice zombie apocalypse. At first, she was convinced that Stannis Baratheon was the chosen one, before she eventually settles on Jon Snow.
He's the prince that was promised.
Okay, so who's Azor Ahai?
Alright, so now I will explain the first Long Night and Azor Ahai. So Azor Ahai was a warrior who was born in Essos about 8,000 years before Aegon's conquest. He is the legendary hero of this religion, whose name I don't know how to pronounce. And this religion is also known as the Lord of Light. Azor Ahai was the chosen one to defeat the Great Other. That's the dark god in this religion.
Like Mephisto?
Not the bears!
Sure, like Mephisto. But to defeat this dark god, he had to forge a mythical, powerful sword. So after hundreds and hundreds of days and 2 tries, the sword was still not powerful enough to defeat this Great Other. So to make the sword invincible, he had to plunge it into the heart of his wife.
But why? Why would he do that?
Well, because Doug doing this placed her soul in the sword, and the sword was called Lightbringer, basically a big flaming sword.
Like a lightsaber.
Sure, like a lightsaber. So Azor Ahai uses Lightbringer to end the Long Night, which was probably the first ice zombie apocalypse, and it was foreseen that he would be resurrected as a prince who was promised.
That noun has no gender in High Valyrian, so the proper translation for that prophecy would be the prince or princess who was promised will bring the dawn.
And this prince or princess or both would save the world. Now this prophecy says that the prince will be born in a place of salt and smoke, and that the prince will wake dragons out of stone, and the prophecy also mentioned a bleeding star. So for thousands of years, people were on the lookout for this prince who was promised. Aegon foresaw this prophecy and thought that it might be himself or one of his heirs. 300 years later, Rhaegar Targaryen, that's Daenerys' older brother, thought that he might be the prince who was promised. But eventually, he settled on the idea that his eldest son Aegon would be the prince.
But why would he think that?
Well, when Aegon was born, there was a comet in the sky, like a bleeding star. Although I guess later, Rhaegar must have changed his mind because he deserted his wife and child.
I've abandoned my boy!
And then he legitimized the kid that he had with Lyanna Stark, the baby who would grow up to be Jon Snow, aka Aegon the 6th in the books, maybe the 7th. Kind of hard to remember sometimes. But in the books, Jon's real name will probably be different. A lot of people think he was actually supposed to be named Aemon Targaryen.
So is Jon Snow the prince who was promised?
Okay, so this is where the show gets interesting and where the show makes us think that Jon and Daenerys might have both been a combination of this prophecy. And I'm going to talk about how this relates to the dragons dying out and their eventual rebirth. So Daenerys was born in a place of salt and smoke, the island of Dragonstone. She also brought dragons out of stone. Her sacrifice at the end of season 1 brought her stone dragon eggs to life. Afterwards, we also see a red comet appear in the skies over Westeros and Essos. Tellingly, this comet is over very important characters connected to this prophecy in the show. We see it over Daenerys, over Jon, and over Stannis Baratheon because Melisandre was convinced that he was the prince who was promised. And we also saw the comet appear over Bran, who was destined to become the Three-Eyed Raven and instrumental in defeating the Night King.
Red comet means one thing, boy. Dragons.
Now you could say that the flaming sword of Azor Ahai was reborn as a dragon, because a dragon spewing flame looks a lot like a flaming sword. If this is the case, you gotta remember both Jon and Daenerys are dragon riders and wield these flaming swords. Jon is also a person who actually united Westeros, or most of it, against the Long Night. And he ended the series by stabbing the woman he loves in the heart, just like Azor Ahai did. And most importantly, Jon and Daenerys are both Targaryens, basically fulfilling Aegon's prophetic dream. Arya even uses Aegon's dagger to kill the Night King and end the Long Night, bringing Aegon's vision full circle.
What do we say to the god of death? Not today.
And here's where all of this ties back into the dragons. We have these two primordial forces at work, the Lord of Light and the Great Other. The dragons serve the Lord of Light, and the White Walkers serve the Great Other. So the Lord of Light allowed the Targaryens to use dragons as long as they were used in the service of this mission, to guard against the Long Night. Now, as soon as the Targaryens started to use the dragons for their own glory, the magic that sustained the dragons slowly left the world, and
Lost dragons were no larger than cats.
this theory makes way more sense than the maesters poisoning the dragons. After the Dance of Dragons is over, there are still 4 full-size dragons left alive, and not all of them are in the care of maesters or even living in the dragon pit. And yet, those dragons stopped producing clutches of eggs that would hatch, so the dragons ended up dying out without a whimper. And also, I should note that a major reason for the dragon's stunted growth is that they were chained up in the dragon pit. As we saw in Game of Thrones, dragons basically get depressed when they're in captivity and they stop eating.
They must be unchained or they'll waste away.
Now, the Targaryens did try to revive the dragons. One king had 9 wizards cross the narrow sea to hatch the remaining eggs. One king prayed to the 7 gods to hatch an egg, which didn't work because, like I said, those gods aren't even real. And Aegon IV even built a mechanical dragon that shot jets of wildfire. In theory, at least, it actually worked more like this.
It's the poor carpenter that blames his shoddy tools for the— Ow!
But all of this was futile, and the dragons would not be reborn until Daenerys used blood magic and sacrificed her own flesh on the pyre of her beloved. The sacrifice worked, much like Azor Ahai plunging his sword into the chest of his wife. Both Daenerys and Azor Ahai used their sacrifices to bring their different flaming swords into existence. Remember, the dragons are like the flaming sword Lightbringer, the one used by Azor Ahai to end the Long Night. And so the Lord of Light brought back Jon Snow and brought back the dragons so Daenerys and Jon could fulfill Aegon's purpose, so they could end the Long Night by using their flaming swords. And after the Long Night ended, the dragons and the prophecy lost their purpose. So Daenerys committed the sin of pride. She never heard the prophecy that Aegon passed down her line, so she believed that her purpose was to serve herself for her own glory. The magic within her Targaryen veins drove her mad with pride. If Daenerys had been left alive, she would have used her dragons and their magic to unleash a great evil, maybe even an evil that would allow the Great Other to return. Instead, Jon Snow had to end the life of the woman he loved, sacrificing his own soul in the process. He killed the woman he loved for the greater good, just like Azor Ahai. Well, that's what I think of the prophecy and why the dragons died out, but if you have any thoughts, let me know in the comments below, or you can @ me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.